Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Get Into It with Gila. I'm Gila Glassberg, your host, and today I have with me Talia Becker. Hi, Talia.
Hi, thanks for having me. It's very appreciated.
Sure. I'm so happy to finally have you on. It's been so hard to actually get people to interview because of the beginning of school and canceling and kids. I already
For
canceled with
sure.
so many other people also, so I'm so happy that you're here. Could you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself? Where do you live? What do you do?
Sure. Thanks so much for asking.
Sure.
I'm in Highland Park. My practice is in Highland Park. And I'm an eating disorder therapist. So specialize in eating disorders, and then also because eating disorders is not just about eating disorders, also specialize in anxiety and depression. Is usually what kind of fuels the eating disorder. I have someone who is currently working for me. So the population that I take is the young adults and up, and she generally sees like the teenagers and the children. So we kind of try to tackle both populations together. Um, and yeah, I guess we do a combination of like CBT, supportive psychotherapy, DBT, and like basically the modalities that we use, and psychoanalytic as well.
Very cool. And so did you always know that you wanted to be a therapist? Did you always know you wanted to specifically do eating disorders?
Yeah, so I always growing up, I really just loved like if my friends were upset, like I always wanted to help them. Like I just found it always very interesting. Like what's making you upset? Why is it making you upset? And then like as I got older and I learned that like that can be a real life job, which I was like, that's
Hmm.
crazy. Like you can just get paid to talk to people. Wow, that's so interesting.
Hmm.
So I think I always gravitated towards that. Definitely specifically eating disorders. I think there are many reasons for that. In camp who I thought that was very interesting. I guess also like I had myself like there's no way I would ever struggle with food. Like I love food. How could that ever happen? And then yes, lo and behold, there were definitely times where I also like, okay, I'm gonna do this, trend or this trend and got right. So I had a good friend in camp who struggled. And I found that very interesting that she was struggling with food, especially at that point in camp. There weren't so many people who had eating disorders, and it was, oh wow, she's not eating that, or she would like hide things under her napkin. And I was like, this is really interesting behavior. And I remember also saying, like, oh, I would never struggle with my food. And then lo and behold, there were definitely food trends that I tried or things that were maybe extreme that I tried. And thankfully it ended up being okay. But I kind of thought to myself, well, if this was so hard for just a little bit of time, what about people who are suffering for so much longer? And that really got me interested in the field. Also, and I think you probably can relate to this, maybe we'll talk about this later, just like being a religious Jew, there's just so many expectations and like unrealistic expectations. And there's so much food always, right? So like when
Hmm.
I run the eating disorder groups and we tell the non-Jewish patients like every Shabbos is basically like Thanksgiving, but every weekend they're like floored. Like, how do you manage that? Like that must be so hard and crazy, right? So like we have all these expectations of all this food we
Hmm.
should be eating, and then we have to show up at shul every week. You go to synagogue, you want to look a certain way, you want to dress a certain way, and then depending on how religious you are, you're thinking about marriage and then having kids, and your body should bounce back, and all these different things. So I found it all very interesting, and because I was able to relate to some degree, even more so, I was like, okay, this is the field I definitely want to go into. And then kind of went from there. So went to Yeshiva University for undergrad, went to Hunter for social work, and then from there really made a point to get like eating disorder experience through private practices, and eventually made my way to New Jersey to Robert Wood Johnson and worked on the eating disorder unit for both inpatient and
Wow.
outpatient, eventually
Wow.
private practice. Yeah.
Wow. So I know for myself, I had a similar, I think so many dietitians end up becoming dietitians because they've struggled with food. I think there's actually a statistic that like 80% of dietitians have disordered eating or something. Christy Harrison talks about that on her podcast. But
Mm-hmm.
anyways, what's interesting to me is that, well, what was interesting is that it's such an intense field. It's such an intense job. Like you said before, like talking, like I always say that like when I'm having an eating disorder client versus a disordered eating client, it's like a whole different mental load. So like, did you expect that when you went into the job that it was going to be really like something that took over sort of like your brain space?
Right. So, I mean, a lot of people, when I told them, like, oh, like when I moved to the community, like, oh, so you moved to the community before? I'm like, oh, I'm starting a job at Robert Wood Johnson on the inpatient unit for eating disorders. And they were all like, whoa, like do you know what you're getting yourself into? So like kind of what you're saying. And I guess also because again, I had my own like extreme ways of thinking at times. I was able to relate more and I'm able to, I think, be more patient than someone who hasn't gone through it because I think, and not that everyone says this, but it's like, oh, just eat, right? Or like just
Mm-hmm.
stop the behavior, or like
Right.
think about your future. And like, if of course it was only that easy, these programs wouldn't exist and everyone would
Mm-hmm.
just be okay and totally fine. So
Right.
I definitely knew going into it I would have a lot more patience, but I think walking onto the inpatient unit and seeing the individuals who are coming in like at a very low body weight and still refusing or believing that their body weighed so much more or looks so differently, sometimes those were like very eye-opening for me that like, whoa, this person is emotionally so far gone that they can't, like, they're in the hospital, they need a feeding tube, their weight is like 50% of their ideal body weight and they're still refusing. Or like we'd have children who parents would bring them in and they'd literally like, there was one teenager who was like clinging onto the car tire because she was just so petrified of like getting the help and getting the treatment. So a lot of times it was a little bit shocking. And then, of course, you also have the people who are checking in who want to be there and who want to get the help. And that's also like, so, which I'm sure you know also as a dietitian working with eating disorders too, like the patients who are so motivated and they want to get the help and you see that they're succeeding, like that's also just so incredibly motivating and just like inspiring to see.
Yeah, 100%. No, that's very well said because I know for myself, like I keep sort of like vacillating between like I'm gonna take on eating disorder cases or I'm gonna get like an extra level of training or should I just stick to the disordered eating? I'm more like called to the disordered eating because that's what I struggled with. Although I would say like borderline over like an eating disorder with like I could also relate to clients very well because I was also in a space of like being so afraid of food and having such strong food rules um and then like overcoming that, but still feeling like I can't eat candy during the week, but I could eat it on Shabbos, lots of restricting,
Mm,
lots of binging until I actually read intuitive eating and I was like, oh, I'm still restricting, like 10 years
right. All
later.
these food rules that we think
Yeah,
are not rules, just like, oh, the whole world, especially when you're like Jewish, right? Oh, no one's
yeah,
eating challah during the week. So like
right,
everyone's eating challah on Shabbos. Like I'll just wait till Shabbos, like
right,
no one's
right.
having dessert then. I'll just wait till Shabbos to have it.
Right. And then when you enter like the actual field, it's like, wow, this is really hard. And like it is very heartbreaking to see some, like you said, somebody 50% of their ideal body weight and on a feeding tube and still believing, being so emotionally like far gone that they still believe that they're, in a different body. It's just very intense. It's a very intense thing. You have to
Yeah.
be able to
Yeah.
handle an intense job.
Right. And I remember also when I first started, so my coworkers, like patients, like they discharged and then like 2 months later they came back. And I was like, oh, wow, like, does this happen often? And they were like, oh, this happens very, and then like my patients also would start to come back, which was like, I think that everyone has their own way of progressing, and some people need tune-ups and some people need multiple times of coming in and out, but like it really also highlighted for me just how intense it can be. That like even if you go to inpatient once doesn't mean you're cured. Even if you go twice doesn't mean you're cured. Even if you went to residential and then came back to inpatient and then left and then came back for a day program doesn't mean you're cured either. So I also think that there's this like fantasy or this idea that like, great, we're going to send the patient to an inpatient residential. They're going to come home. They're going to be amazing. And it's like we always say, well, the work really starts when you get home because when you're in this bubble and everything's perfect and there's no triggers, even though it's not perfect in the sense that you're working on all these things and you're exposing yourself to all these foods, like it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be 100% cured either. And I feel like so many people think, oh, just send them away and send them back and they'll be fine. It's like, well, it's also not that simple as
For
well.
sure, for sure. I want to ask you two things actually about what you said. First of all, I want to ask you about like what you see in the Jewish population versus the non-Jewish population because I've heard so many different things. I've heard that like in the non-Jewish world, the way that you look is much more a focal point. And I've also heard that in the Jewish world, it's much more stressed. Like so I just heard this actually on a podcast today that somebody was at the subway station and she saw like a bunch of like people who were probably not Jewish dressed in like casual clothes or no makeup pony, and then she saw a bunch of women from her community wearing perfect wigs, perfect outfits, dressed to the nines, perfect makeup, and she's like, what? How did this happen? Like, I don't know if you see that. um yeah, and I also wanted to ask you, like, if you notice you had so much diverse experience in eating disorders, do you see like what are the trends that you see that have triggered the eating disorder? Or like you said, yeah, I always tell this to clients, like most people have their like eating disorders don't exist in a vacuum. You're probably struggling with also anxiety, depression, OCD, bipolar. But what are the trends that you see? Like, is it mostly from diet culture in the home, from school, from friends? Is it mostly um peer pressure, like I said before, in the Jewish Orthodox community, the pressure of like looking perfect, being perfect? What are things that you see? So I guess I asked you two questions, but answer however
So
you
yeah, so I'm going to answer the latter question first, and then we'll get back to the other one.
want.
So yeah, eating disorders don't, like you said, they don't happen in a vacuum. I think a couple factors go into it. Definitely, a lot of them start with someone wanting to be healthy and going on a diet, and if they have tendencies to be obsessive, it stops going from, oh, I want to be healthy, to I need to be the thinnest. I need to be the best. I need to eat the most perfect food. I need to like weigh my self esteem by how much I weigh on the scale. It has to be the lowest numbers. So definitely starting a diet, which I think so many people go into being like, oh, it's like a trend. It's gonna be so fun. Let's workplace diet together. Woohoo. It's like, okay, but you also have to know that like that can turn into something really obsessive and potentially really dangerous. And like not many people are fully aware of that. That's number one. Number two, it's definitely a lot of trauma related, unfortunately, issues. And whether people are trying to hide their bodies and being the thinnest they can possibly be so no one touches them, or people who actually want to have a bigger body so that they feel empowered and no one's going to come near them either. So, like, trauma definitely plays into it. Perfectionism, like, whatever message they're getting at the home, whatever they're seeing from their parents or their friends, or what's cool and trendy. And even now, like, when we were growing up, like we didn't have really access to social media. It was like AOL.com and you're listening to see if you can like connect and you're hoping, okay, you're going to message your friends. And now it's like Instagram. And the patients that I have, some of the teenagers that I do see, like they tell me that it's like trendy to like have a certain body shape, which is like trend. You can't just buy the body shape from the store, right? It's like,
Right,
how can you, like, yeah, there were trendy clothing you can go to a store and purchase. Like,
right,
you can't purchase like a bigger booty, right? You can't
right.
purchase like muscles. Like, so they're also driving themselves crazy at the gym and eating a certain way and looking at these videos on Instagram and being like,
Yeah.
well, if I just did what she did,
Mm-hmm.
I look this way. So again, always unrealistic expectation. And then again, depression, anxiety, not feeling in control, 100% all plays into it.
It's so sad. The social media thing is such a hard thing to wrap my head around because it's like the clients that I've seen who were like really, really struggling. A lot of I heard so many things. Like, yeah, it started from like this exercise trend that I saw on TikTok, or like what like you said, and it's funny that you said that about the trendy body. I always tell this to clients that like I think in like the 60s, right? Like Twiggy, it was like the 60s, it was very into be like super skinny, no bust, and
Right.
no, right, and no behinds. And now it's like the trend is literally like super curvy, busty, tiny, tiny waist, and like like a bigger behind. And it's like that doesn't even exist naturally. Like how much of the population looks like that? Nobody
Nobody.
naturally. So it's like
No.
it's really crazy. Like I don't even want to say unattainable because like it's like attaining your shoe size. Or I said once to a
Right.
client,
Right. Right.
it's like having it's not green eyes. It's like having red eyes. Like I wish
Right,
I
it's
had red
genetics.
eyes.
Like you can't fight it for sure. For
Right.
sure. But this is
Right.
what, and then the photoshopping and the filters, and it's like, well, it looks real, but it's definitely not.
Right, right. So that's so, so, so hard, especially for teenagers. Like, I mean, for adults, it's so hard also. Like, I'll tell
Right.
that to my teenage clients. Like, it's still hard when you're an adult. We still all compare
Oh,
how
for
skinny is
sure.
that girl after birth and how nice is her table, and we're all doing it. It's just like so much harder as a teen to actually like function like that.
Also, you have so much less control as a teen, right? Because you're like living in this house, you're kind of stuck. You have to go to school every day. Like high school for some of my patients is torture. And like they don't,
Yeah.
you have to go unless you like get pulled out and get your GED or whatever. But most people don't know that's an option, number one. And most people don't want to do that. So like they're just stuck, unfortunately, which is also so hard.
Yeah, that is really sad. I know. I'm like, I feel like I struggled all my years through school, scholastically, and like just keeping up. And like now that my kids are in school, I'm like, my heart's breaking for you guys. Like, I can't believe I have to make you do this. It's
Right. I
hard.
know.
It's
It's
hard.
so hard. It's really so hard. And also, like, again, they don't teach like coping skills class, right? It's like, okay, math 2 plus 2, fine, that's great. Yes, you
Right.
should obviously know how to read, and history is important, and the Judaic studies, of course, but like coping skills is so important, and, like, it's just so interesting how that hasn't been integrated into the curriculum yet, because, like, if you just know how to cope instead of being like, "Well, I'm just not gonna eat because I'm gonna feel in control, I'm gonna be the thinnest,
Yeah.
make me feel happy," clearly that's not gonna work in the long run, and then I have those patients who I run group for in their 50s and 60s, and even I've seen patients in the hospital check in at 70, and they're just like, "I wish I would have done this sooner." And, like, it's still trending for
Wow.
them, unfortunately, because
Right.
they didn't have access to care either at that point.
Right. Right.
So,
Actually,
hard.
on that note of like kids not feeling in control, kids and teens, like I actually heard do you know Dr. Becky? Dr. Becky, okay, she has a podcast called Good Inside, and she's also on
Oh,
Instagram. And she was
interesting.
saying, yeah, she said such a funny thing. She said, like, I want you to realize how much our kids feel like out of control, meaning like they don't have control of their life. And like she's like, I said to my son, you tell me when you want me to take a shower. Like you just tell me. And like he came home from school and he's like, now, mommy. And she's like, it was so annoying. I just washed my hair. Like I really didn't want to take a shower. And we do that to our kids all the time. Stop playing outside, go
True.
take a shower, come inside, time to eat. And it's like we have to do that as their parents. But like
Right.
imagine if someone was doing that to us, like as adults. It's like really annoying.
Horrible. No, it's such a good point, which is so true, and I think also, like, there are so many things even as an adult you don't have control over, like, people
Right, of
go to their
course.
work and they hate their job, right? People sometimes get stuck in a relationship that they can't get out of, right? Sometimes you get in fights with your friends or whatever it is, and, like, yeah, food is something which this is, like, the basic of eating disorder 101, it's just something that you can control,
Mm-hmm.
right? So if
Mm-hmm.
you're feeling trapped otherwise, of course, you're gonna gravitate towards the food.
Right. And I also say this also that like in our religious circles, like there's not so much kosher entertainment. So it's like if well I can't it depends where you live, but I can't go to the movies and I can't go to a Broadway show and I can't go biking outside. In some communities I can't go jogging. Like, okay, so I can't afford the gym or whatever. It's like food is always there. Food is a constant. Food
True,
is like
for
just an easy,
sure.
accessible way to either restrict or to binge or to cope or however. So it's like
Right.
just, acknowledging that as a reality is important.
For sure. And I think also like I run a group for religious Jewish women and like it is really hard. There's not always so many outlets and they also feel like their communities may not understand or their husbands don't understand, which makes it harder also because they're trying to educate and the husband's like, "Well, you're beautiful the way you are. Like you're perfect. You're fine." And that's not that's not what they're looking for, right? They're kind of
Right.
looking for more. So also just spouses or people who are in a relationship with an eating disorder and like educating the other person if they get it, if they don't get it, it's just like another layer of like complications.
For sure. I feel like if you've never struggled with food, you just cannot understand the grasp that the eating disorder could have on your brain.
Right. For sure. Definitely.
So what is it that you see like differently in the Jewish versus the non-Jewish world that like do you think it is harder in the Jewish world?
Um, I mean, I think that like at the core level, like when they come in to any sort of treatment, like I think when they're coming in like just so distraught, I think it's equally just as hard. Because I
Mm-hmm.
think that each community has their own expectations. And I think that like, yes, like the non-Jews looking at the Jews and being like, oh my God, every Shabbos, that's so crazy. And like you have to look a certain way. But then I also think that the non-Jews looking at the Jews like, oh well, you're wearing like short shorts, like you're
Right.
wearing tank tops, you're
Right.
showing more skin.
Right.
Like you go to the beach and you do show like you are expected to wear a bikini. Like
Mm-hmm.
I think it's hard for each person because they have their own things that are like normalized in their own culture that like makes it difficult for both them because at the end of the day they're both coming in whether Jewish, not Jewish, man, woman, teenager, adult, they're all just feeling like so helpless, so out of control, even though they're grasping for control with the eating disorder, and they're all feeling like this is way too hard. There's no way I can just have a normal relationship with food. Like I think that's really where they're all holding when they come in when it's just like so desperate.
Yeah, that makes sense. Actually, I think that's helpful for people to hear that it's like I think maybe when people hear it's like harder in the Frum community or the Orthodox community or in the non-Jewish community, they're like, oh, well, it's because of my community. But it's true, you're right. It's like we all have our struggles in every community, and like both of those things can make it really hard. Like having Shabbos every week and that amount of food, and also having an expectation to show more skin could also make it harder.
Right.
And tznius could also make it harder because there's like for some people there's a level of body shame. For some people, it's like saving grace. It's just different.
Right.
It's different for every
Exactly.
person.
for sure.
I wonder if you could share, like, this would probably be interesting for clients to hear, like, I mean for followers, listeners to hear. What is it like when somebody enters eating disorder treatment, like either goes to the hospital or comes to see you? Like, what's the usual progression of the illness?
Yeah, so I'm gonna go through it as if they checked into inpatient and slowly making their way down to like eventually like an outpatient. So when they come in to inpatient, at any weight, whatever it is, obviously annoyingly so, insurance has to approve it. Generally speaking, for the most part, it goes through. When it doesn't, it's a different story, but we'll save that for a different time because we all hate
Yeah,
insurance, yada yada.
yeah, yeah.
So they come in initially and they get like blood work done, they get weighed. Um, and once they have all that information, they check in, they have the bed. And basically, inpatient is obviously very intense, right? Inpatient is like when you're coming in, you're obviously pretty sick. A lot of times people come to inpatient if like they're trying to get into residential, and because residential is not a hospital, they'll say you need to like make sure you're medically stable at the hospital before you go into residential. But I'll take, for example, Robert Wood Johnson. So basically, what happens is that you're working on renourishing yourself and eating more and eating properly. So you're working with an entire team. So you have the nurse who's always on the unit, you have a therapist who in inpatient you see every day, you have a dietitian who you basically see every day, and then there's a psychiatrist who you meet with also every day if in case you need medication or anything to help um, in that sense. And basically, they have communal meals. So every morning you wake up, everyone, well, they get up really early to get weighed every day. And then at 8 o'clock is breakfast for everyone. And then from like 9 to 12 is different groups. So you have a nutrition group, you have a therapy group, you have a nursing group, you have like a group about medication. So just really like educating them on what they're doing to their bodies. And even if they think they're doing something good for their bodies because they're being quote unquote healthy,
Hmm.
we're kind of like telling you it's too extreme. Like this is not okay. And they take it from like a nutrition standpoint, a medical standpoint, a mental standpoint, and then also groups on body image and coping skills. Fine. Then at lunchtime, so they do like it's kind of really nice. They have like cake day and dessert day because so much of it is exposure, right? You're
Yeah.
so free to eat something. So you have to pick. It's gonna be ice cream, it's gonna be cake, it's gonna be cupcake, it's gonna be this. So like you have to do it. And if you don't complete the meals, then also it's kind of like behavioral based, like you don't get your phone that day, so like they try to make it that you're more willing to do it. And then after lunch, same multiple groups, then dinner is together, and then there's always the option of having a snack at night if you want like to get extra food or something like that. And that's basically the day to day. If you're depending on what level you are, like sometimes you might have to be on bed rest, sometimes you do have the privilege of maybe taking a walk if possible. And then once you get so in order to leave inpatient, you have to be 85% of your ideal body weight if you're like someone who needs to gain weight, or if you're mentally doing better, to the therapist and dietitian test depending on how much you're eating or how well you're eating and stuff like that. You move on to the partial hospitalization program. So then you get to go home, which is always very exciting. And the partial hospitalization is 5 days a week from 9 to 3, depending on the program. They get weighed every single day and they have a snack, a lunch, and a snack together. And then for breakfast and dinner, you're on your own. And eventually, if you go through that and you're doing well, you go to IOP, which is like 3 days a week from 9 to 1:30. So they really try to like transition you out with a
Yeah.
lot of support. And once you master that, they basically say, okay, now it's time for you to go to an outpatient provider. And that's where I would meet them when they're heading there, unless someone just comes who's never been in therapy before, who doesn't need hospitalization. If they're just starting with me, then we do the intake, we take their history, and kind of like, again, just figuring out like, what are their food rules? What are they having obsessive tendencies, perfectionism, like getting really to the underlying issue, which usually takes a lot of time. It doesn't
Yeah.
happen in one session. It takes a
Yeah.
while. Yeah. So that's
Yeah.
kind of like the trajectory.
Thank you for explaining that. I think it's important for people to hear that it's like really, really, it's like there's so much support needed when somebody has a full-blown eating disorder, and even within the hospital, there's like so many different levels and so much different, like, you know, ways of treatment, and it's just like it's such an intense thing, but it's like that's how intense eating disorders are, that you really need that much support to get through it.
Yeah. I mean, even like we wouldn't let like if people weren't doing partial because they had a job, like we don't let them leave the hospital unless like we know that they had an appointment with the therapist and a dietitian and a psychiatrist and a doctor. So like we're very like serious about it. Like they need
Right.
follow-up treatment.
Right, for
Especially
sure.
because all the people who like end up coming back.
For sure, for sure. And then people who see you in your office after they've left the IOP, I always say that wrong, IOP,
Yeah.
um, they see you once a week or twice a week or sometimes multiple times a week.
Yeah, it just depends. Like some who need it 3 times a week. I mean that's pretty rare unless like I'm seeing them twice a week and something pops up where they want a third time. Sometimes it's two, sometimes it's one. Coming from IOP, maybe I'll start with two just to like make sure they're okay. But for the most part, it ends up being one. It just depends really what the patient feels like they need or what I think they need. And also I like kind of like giving them the benefit of the doubt, like the least treatment, so they can like also live a normal life.
Right,
Like once
right.
they made it through the system and they're like a little bit like not dumb, they're like, oh, I just want to live a normal life. And if they're telling me they want to live a normal life and they're not obsessed with like the eating disorder and treatment and they don't need that constant reassurance, I'm like, good, like get back
Yeah,
into normal living and have to
yeah,
be like thinking about food 24/7 or therapy 24/7. Like I'm very happy once they get to that point also.
yeah, yeah. What do you think there, well, like what's one thing or two things that you could say as like therapists, dietitians listening, or even just like regular listeners, like how could we, I want to talk about intuitive eating and how you got introduced to it, but like what could we do as like um, parents and clinicians and just people in the world like to try to help like decrease the eating disorder, like the normalcy of disordered eating and eating disorders in the world.
Right. That's a really good question. Thanks for asking that. I think a
Sure.
lot of it comes from just awareness. And I think that like we say things all the time that whether we really mean it or we don't, right? Like I think people say, like, "Oh, this is horrible, I'm gonna kill myself," and it's like, but that's
Mm,
don't say that. Like that's
hmm.
really inconsiderate for other people who may be struggling, and like that's just again not necessarily an appropriate thing to say. So I also think that like it's so easy, like, "Oh, I feel so gross today. I feel so ugly today." Like, "Oh my God, I just ate all this. I probably gained 5 pounds today." So like saying those things and putting them out into the universe. First of all, for parents, especially kids eat up everything. They hear everything, they see everything. My kids also, I'm like spacing out and they'll be like, Mommy, are you okay? And I'm like, yeah, why? They're like, you're like not you're like weird. I'm like, oh, like they're so and they're 5 and 8, right? So they're like they know everything, they see everything. So I think especially as parents, if you can do this, keep your comments to yourself. Again, if you're struggling with your body weight, maybe you can talk to your husband about it, get a therapist, get a dietitian, because like kids pick up even like random energy in the house. They just know. They like always know.
Hmm.
I think for practitioners, for sure, like intuitive eating from the dietitian, like all foods fit approach is so helpful because so many patients, yes, they're like recovering, but then they go into like orthorexia or they're only eating the healthiest foods possible, which is like, all right, if you want to live your life, I guess that's your choice. Like you're not going to live the best, like most happy life that you can if you're still restricting to a certain degree, even if let's say they're eating enough to support their body weight, but they're only eating salads or sweet potatoes or whatever it is. That's not really like such an amazing life either. So I think the
Hmm.
all foods fit approach for sure and like intuitive eating. And I think just like validate, validate, validate. Because so many people with eating disorders, they come in, they think they're crazy, they think no one understands, they think someone's just going to be like dismissive, like you did this to yourself, this is your problem, just eat and move
Hmm.
on. So
So
like,
sad.
yeah, so like for someone to say like, I hear you, it's not your fault. Like I know this is so hard for you, and like how can I hold your hands and like help you with this? And like sometimes I'll
Hmm.
offer like if you want to have a snack together, like in Zoom, that's fine. Like we can do this together. You're not alone. So validation goes such a long way and just like getting those food rules like taken off of their plate and that all foods fit intuitive eating approach is also extremely helpful.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's such a good thing. I interviewed somebody recently. I didn't put out that episode yet, but she was talking about like that chronic what's the word that she said? It was such a good one. I really thought about it. Chronic dismissiveness? No. Not maybe it was chronic not validating your feelings, but it was a word. I can't remember what she said. Chronic,
Maybe
right.
chronic
I
invalidation.
think that's what it was. Chronic invalidation. And I was like, yes, that's so like what we've all like so many of us have been through as kids. Like I know now it's like we're swinging to the opposite extreme of like everything is validated, but like it's so true that like people who have struggled with eating disorders or are struggling, they really feel like they're alone. And like that's probably like half the battle of like not feeling alone. And like I love that you said like having a snack together. That's probably I've done that with clients too. That's probably like just like super supportive.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it also is like invalidating in terms of their emotions, right? So like you shut down your emotions, then you shut down, you don't listen to your body at all, right? So
Hmm.
also when you're not eating, there's no emotions because all you're focusing on is just not eating. Or
Totally.
like if you're overeating and you're binging, you're just stuffing all your emotions down. And like I think also very much like our generation, our parents' generation, our grandparents' generation, like our grandparents, like they were like World War II Holocaust survivors. So for them, like nothing is as bad as being in a war, which 100%. But then like for the next generation and everything else, it's like just get over it because like I was in a war, right? Or like my parents were in a war. So like you don't like yes, your feelings are valid, but maybe not as valid as like because nothing as bad as like what my parents went through, so to speak. So I think also just like that generation of feeling like, oh, I can't have feelings or they're not valid or it has to be so bad for me to like feel this way, which again also plays into I have to be so sick in order to get the
Mm-hmm.
help because it has to
Mm-hmm.
be so bad because that's what they were taught growing up that only if it's extremely bad then do you get the help. So I think
Mm-hmm.
also like a lot of invalidation of feelings, which is like we're all human, of course we have to feel, and if we don't
Right.
feel, that's when the eating disorder can come about.
I actually really like that you said that about the Holocaust, and I think I think about that a lot. Like about I've heard that in my office a lot that like people who are like so depressed or struggling so much, and like this thing in their life is really like hurting them, whether it's food or not food or body image or not body image, and they're like, yeah, but my parent or grandparent or great grandparent like literally how could I complain? Like they went through the Holocaust, and it's like it's such a sad. I feel like it's almost like Hitler hurting us like now in 2022. That's what I feel like. That it's
Right.
like there's just so
Mm-hmm.
much dismissiveness and so much. I hope I'm not offending anybody by saying that, but I just feel like it's so like I love what you said about when you were talking about people being in treatment and being in the hospital and getting daily support of the dietitian and the therapist and the psychiatrist and learning coping skills, and you were talking about that before, how like we don't have that class in school, like coping 101. It's like, okay, so the people who actually go through the eating disorder are probably so much like better off almost because they've learned these coping skills. But if only we could preempt it, like if only we could allow people to feel,
Right.
give people the coping skills when they're young, like then we would, alleviate a lot of these issues actually.
For sure. It's actually it's funny that you said that in my group last night, and the other patients or the individual whatever clients, they were laughing and she's like, yeah, I went to eating school and like it's just so funny. Like, but I think there should be a course on eating. Like, yeah, eating school
Yeah.
is treatment, but like I think we all need it because we get so many mixed messages. Like one day carbs are bad, one day carbs are good, one day fat is bad, one day fat is good, one day like this vitamin is good and then it's bad. Like that's constantly happening or like whatever it is. So like, like eggs raise your cholesterol, they don't raise your cholesterol. So many
Mm-hmm.
mixed messages. So like I think that if there was an actual nutrition class that was like based on like evidence and health and taking into coping skills and diet culture, like that would be so helpful. But it seems like we're just not there yet.
Well, I will say two things. One is that somebody reached out to me recently and she's like, this is so crazy. Like in my daughter's schools, they're so on top of like the healthy snack. And in my son's schools, all the Rebbe's are giving out candies. Like, what type of messaging is that? And I was like, yeah,
Classic, yeah.
so she was like, let's go into the schools and teach them. And I just to give everybody like a little bit of hope, actually, last year I spoke in Hafter to the 10th grade girls. Like the
Mhm.
schools are definitely interested. Another school reached out, and I hope one day it should be more of like workshops, like yearly, like annually, that like
For
at the
sure.
beginning of school or like towards the end of school, like these like kids in elementary school and high school and older, obviously, like they really need support through this, like you said, like those mixed messages. Like I just had a session before this about like teaching somebody what does hunger feel like, what does fullness feel like. You know why? Because for since we were kids we were like, you can't be hungry, you just ate.
Right,
And like you don't have to go to the bathroom. Like so then it's like we're just all confused, like what is my body actually telling me? And like we
right.
need to teach those skills. Those are life skills.
For sure. And I think also like kind of related to that also like definitely getting in touch physically and also like emotionally, right? Because I think we're so quick to be like, oh my gosh, you look beautiful. Like, did you lose weight? It's like, maybe you could just be like, you look beautiful because you look so happy. Like you're glowing today. Or like, is something wrong? Like you seem sad. And like we always educate the parents and like never say like, oh, you're not eating. What's wrong? Like you seem really sad. Like what's going on? Like, oh, you seem really happy today. Because at the end of the day, if they're sad, then they're going to engage in the eating disorder. And if they're feeling better, they're probably not. So I think also like getting in touch with their bodily cues and also their emotional cues
Mm-hmm.
and parents picking up on the emotional cues and not just being like, you need to eat. It's like, well, are you
Mm-hmm.
sad? Like, do you need extra support right now? Like,
Mm-hmm.
focus on that. Because complimenting on the body, like, oh, just you look so happy, you're glowing. That's so beautiful. I love that. Like, that
Mm-hmm.
really changes the perspective also of like what's beauty versus not.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of talk about like when you see somebody who you haven't seen in a while, instead of complimenting like, wow, you look awesome, like it's so good to see you. I've missed you. Not that you can't compliment the way that somebody looks, but I feel like there, like you said in the beginning, I think like that focus of like what we talk about, what we put out into the world. So for for that person that's always like noticing the way somebody looks versus like how funny they are or like how smart they are or like, it's like a totally different type of vibe than like the way that it is now, which is just like this crazy emphasis on like how we look and more about like how skinny we are, really. There's like such
Right,
an emphasis on that.
right, for sure, right. And I think also like, and I said this to my patients a lot too, that like if you see someone and they're gorgeous and they open their mouth and they're mean or they like just say stupid things, like they're not really so pretty anymore, right? So
Right.
like we hold this idea in our head, like everyone's gorgeous, but like that's not really true. Gorgeous is not just how you look on the outside. Gorgeous is like a whole package of like
Right.
how you act and how you behave. And like, when you get to know people, they become even more stunning because like they're just so nice and giving versus the opposite. So like to really focus on those things. But of course it's really hard when everyone's like, oh, like what's your secret? You look so
Yeah.
skinny. It's like,
Yeah.
oh God, you
It's actually
know.
funny that you say that because I'll just say this. I think this will be like really helpful for listeners to hear is that I said this to both my clients last night and I went to share yesterday and it was on Rosh Hashanah, like the upcoming holiday. And she asked the question to the audience, like she said, like when you think of somebody who you like really, really respect, and like please tell me like what are the qualities about that person that you really respect? And people said like she's so giving and she's so kind and she's so honest, she's so compassionate, right? Like all these things. And then she's like, just notice that nobody said like I love her Porsche, I love her perfect hair, I love how skinny she is.
Right.
Actually,
Right.
and I will say, the client did play devil's advocate, and she's like, "Yeah, nobody's going to admit that in a year." But I'm like, "No, I really want you to think about people who you like love and respect. Like, I don't even think of them as like their physical body. I don't have that. Maybe not everybody's like that, but like I feel like when it comes, like you just said, like when somebody is really beautiful but they're really mean, like it just like we just don't think of them as beautiful anymore, even if they're
Right.
objectively beautiful, whatever that means. So I think that's a really good point. And it's like funny because people are like, wow, you talk about that with your clients, aren't you a dietitian? And it's like you said, it's like the whole package of like
All
of
all
everything.
together.
Just health is so much more than like what you eat, how you exercise, your coping skills, your sleep, your stress management, your the medication that you might need to be on. It's like that whole package. But I think dieting really tries to like limit. It's so limiting.
Oh, for sure. And I think also diet is just, again, like it's just all about how you look. But
Right.
clearly we know that. We know people who might be beautiful and they're just so unhappy. So like dieting
Hmm.
isn't about just how you look. It's how you feel and the memories that you share with food or whatever it is, or like being social and getting out there, which like of course the eating disorder, you're living a very lonely life because it's impossible to keep up because you have all these crazy rules. So
Right.
yeah, health is not just how you look at all. Just unfortunately, this is what diet culture has done to our society.
100%. It's so true. So this was awesome, like such a great interview. Is there anything else you want to leave the listeners with? Any
Um, I guess like for anyone who's listening and you're feeling alone or you're feeling like there's no hope and you can't get help, like again, I have, there's children who come and there's patients in their 60s and I've seen patients in their 70s and like there's never a bad time to start and it's literally never hopeless until like I guess until you really decide that. But like don't allow yourself to decide that until you go to someone who can say for you if it's actually hopeless or not. Because I've definitely had patients who come in and they're like, it's hopeless. Like you're not gonna want to work with me. And I'm always like, let me decide that. Like, thank you for sharing. That's like really kind that you're like thinking of me and what I'm gonna think. But like, let me decide. And you can always start in the next second, next minute, tomorrow's like if you're nervous or you're scared about treatment, definitely reach out to someone. And like there's always hope. Even again, the eating disorder is gonna make you feel like there's never hope, but that's not true. So like there's always hope and please reach out because doing it alone is really hard and like living that kind of life is hard and you don't deserve that.
I mean, I agree. Do you want to, are you taking new patients now? New clients?
I am taking a few new patients, yes.
Okay, so where could people find you?
Oh, really good question. On Psychology Today, you could find me at Talia Becker or on Instagram, Talia Becker LCSW or whatever at I don't know handle. I don't know what it's called.
I'll put all your information in the show notes so people can find you.
Oh, thank you, thank you.
Okay, thank
Thanks
you.
for having me. I'm excited to do. Like, I wanna eventually, and I know we're running out of time now, but like I wanna like intuitive eating, like for my patients like hearing more about it because they're very like, I can't intuitive eat, which is also something I'm working on with them, but like that won't
Right.
work for me. I'll just end up eating all my food, which is like that's not the
Right.
point. So I feel like also like educating from your perspective with intuitive eating would probably be also helpful to the patients that I see as well.
For sure. We could always do like a part two. I'm always up for that.
Perfect. Awesome.
Okay. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Yes, you too. Thank you.
Sure.